today than I have, at least in the last couple of weeks. So I really appreciate what's been presented and the spirit of kind of sharing and learning together. And so this picture here is from 1996. It's this group of women are refugees from southern Tajikistan, and they've made their way into Dushanbe, capital of Tajikistan. And they've made these beautiful, there's actually more beautiful dresses in the next room, but a lot of these clothes these groups have made as part of a microcredit, micro-banking organization. I don't know if any of you know about microcredit and how it works, and probably some of you heard about the Urban Bank. I had a chance to meet them and work with them as we were doing a lot of work in Tajikistan back in those days, and so joined efforts with Save the Children, and Soros Foundation was funding some of this. And those of you who do know about microcredit and microbanking, the way it works is that they are, most of the time, in pure circles where they help each other make better use of their resources so that they can have successful businesses. And they only get the next loan if their neighbor, their peer, their teammate, if you will, produces and is able to be successful to pay back their loan. So this group of women, they were in some ways refugees in their own country. They weren't terribly welcome in the neighborhoods in Dushanbe when they first came back. But under civil war circumstances, several of these women watched their husbands assassinated. None of them had husbands anymore. Many of them watched if they had older boys or they were killed. And so under the worst circumstances, these women returned their loans at a 97% rate. And while they are extraordinary people, they're not that unusual because they were part of a system that set them up to succeed. And so I was very fortunate to get to learn from them for a couple of years while we worked in Central Asia, and it has very much shaped my life and how I think about systems and what is possible and how we set people up to succeed. So most of my personal and professional journey has really centered around a version of this question: how do we create and sustain community health and well-being? And it's still a journey. And so I'm going to share a little bit about this with you. I think all of our collective experiences, all of our research tells us that there's one thing that gives us a chance of transforming community systems, complex systems, and that is people working in groups. People working in groups. And so the question is, how is it that we work in groups in order to transform systems of systems, whether those be neighborhoods, regions, communities? This is part of Greenville, South Carolina. And Greenville, South Carolina, I'm going to share what I would call leading practices or patterns. They're not, to the good points this morning, they're not best case practices, but they're leading practices, they're emergent practices. So Greenville, South Carolina, started working with them, I guess, close to a decade ago. And they had a very simple starting point for Live Well Greenville. Peter and some others have heard part of this story. Is that they basically said, we're going to start off by creating healthier settings. And so they started off in schools using some pretty traditional learning and action collaboratives, bringing back kitchens into their schools, bringing in farmers markets, starting to experiment with growing. And they did this across all of their counties. So they were, in many ways, just like the peer learning groups that I was working with in Tajikistan, they were learning from each other. They were trying to figure out how to experiment and how to adapt it to the different environments, but they understood the patterns and they would grow and scale these things together. And they did this in other settings. They did it in workplaces with small businesses that had very little money with large businesses. Looking at mindfulness, looking at new ways of helping their employees eat better, helping them to become more productive by feeling like they were cared for in their environment authentically, not just they were being gamed. Around town, they started to look at how do we create more bikeable, walkable places, but particularly in the places where it wasn't as safe to do those things, where there were lack of connection. So they were using these same simple process improvement, innovation methods. Wasn't a ton of investment in it, and the peers were leading it. These weren't like gurus that could teach this in some of your organizations. There's this very little training, but they were starting to get results. They no longer call this At the Doctor, but at this time it was called At the Doctor, which was really looking at how they interacted and created relationships with patients. And so they had doctors and nurse practitioners that were doing motivational interviewing, helping to connect with patients to understand what were their real motivations, what were their goals, and how could we start to link them to other community assets and start to create systems around that, right? So at mealtime, looking at policies and houses, working with not-for-profits and all types of families, right? How we would transform those settings in meal places for fun. People used to call these play deserts. How do we transform these play deserts? And what was interesting, I forgot to mention, with one of the things that I found very fascinating about the women that I got to learn from in Tajikistan is not only did they solve each other's problems around how to distribute food products, how to best make dresses and get the best fabrics to do that, and what was going to be selling and where. They started to solve problems in the neighborhoods, and even the neighborhoods that didn't exactly embrace them at first. They started to solve water problems. And this group didn't only solve problems in their settings. Again, I don't want to overstate. They started to get results in all these areas, but they started to come together to solve problems or create changes within Greenville, South Carolina. Anybody been to Greenville lately? Not lately. If you went 20 years ago and if you went yesterday, they're radically different places. In fact, and so a lot of the downtown, the vibrant downtown scene, the water features and all those types of things came partly from some of the work of this group. Really rethinking about what places and doing this placemaking work, starting to turn from just their setting to some shared interests. In fact, Jane Fallows from Atlantic Monthly writes a lot about what's going on in Greenville, South Carolina as a leading practice for how communities come together to solve problems. And the practice I want to put up there, that I think Greenville does a really great job, is that they weave diverse interests together. And I think we've already heard several times this morning about visions. We know about 14 shared visions. We know how important that is. Every group I work with has a vision. Every group I work with has a mission statement. But there's a real difference, and our friends at US Synthetic, remind us a vision that actually has some life to it. You all breathe a lot of life into your value statement and your mission and vision. And the same thing has happened over time in Greenville, South Carolina. Lynn was here earlier. She's not here back, I don't think. But we were just talking about learning each other's language. So they spend a lot of time learning the language of what do schools care about, what do healthcare systems care about, what are their concerns, what are their barriers, and over time that's allowing them to understand what their shared vision is. This was used a little bit differently, but we often will think about how do we achieve diverse goals with common strategies. Divergent goals, convergent strategies, and I think Gene earlier on means when we start to get closer to the root problems is when we're able to start to look at divergent goals with convergent strategies. My friend Eleanor Dunlap, who started this in Greenville, would say when people in Greenville talk about their work, they will describe the outcomes, the benefits very differently in a lot of cases, but we know we're talking about the same vision. What a realtor or health department or what a neighborhood leader talks about is different, but we actually have breathed life into this aligned vision. Columbia, Missouri. In some fluke of life, I ended up living in Columbia, Missouri for about 7 or 8 years. It was because of a medical issue with one of our kids, but it ended up being a serendipity, a great blessing. And during that time, Columbia, Missouri got one of these alternative non-motorized transportation grants from the federal government when they used to do these types of things. So trying to figure out how we would create more folks taking trips outside of using cars. It was one of 4 of the pilot projects. And as these things happen, typically just building better streets and more trails and those types of things, it's not as you build it, they come, right? There's a lot of other pieces to this. So Columbia, Missouri did do that. They redesigned a lot of streets. They redesigned a lot of connections to trails and other parts of their community between the neighborhoods. But a lot of people had been on bikes for a while, right? So there was massive training programs around helping people from different neighborhoods get back on bikes, try to figure out how to get downtown if they weren't downtown or wherever that was, how to deal with their sweaty clothes, how to do these things that we had forgotten, as well as a large population that had never been on a bike, couldn't afford a bike, didn't have a culture of biking, so they had a lot of programs around recycled biking, helmets, all these types of things. A lot of promotion, some brilliant marketing to help people start to see that this is a viable pathway to start to go to the grocery store and other places. And they've created one of the largest walking school bus programs in the country. So you hear of walking school bus programs, basically adult volunteers that had a whole service learning project with the University of Missouri, seniors that were kind of homebound started to take on their role in helping kids. So 18 elementary schools over time had massive amounts of kids walking to school where mostly they had this conjunction of a bunch of mothers and fathers or grandparents with cars clustered around the front. You know the scene? Or buses. So the leading practice of places like Columbia, I think, is really employing a blend of strategies. So they employ the use of policy changes with their street design, policy and practices of their schools that changed the rules by which kids could come in and out of school and who was able to drop them off. They created this incredible walking school bus program, which is an on-ramp that not only brought kids out, but it started to bring seniors out, started to change neighborhoods. And they started to integrate this. You know the two groups that were most against this non-motorized transportation grant? The schools. Why do you think the schools were? Liability. And the Department of Public Works that won this grant, which was fundamentally against this. But over time, and with a lot of relationship building, when this little PedNet coalition started to run out of money, the schools realized it was so popular with parents in neighborhoods that they adopted it. They started to put resources to it. They incorporated it into what they do as part of their mission. And the Department of Public Works completely changed its metrics and job descriptions for how it started to partner with public transportation to really support this type of work. Fundamentally different department now because of this. Living Will Kent. I live in Portland, Oregon, I mentioned. And so just north of me is King County, which is Seattle. But we do a fair amount of work with the CDC. And so on one of these CDC grants, they asked our team to provide some technical assistance to this place called Kent. Anybody been to Kent in southern King County? So in southern King County, increasingly, it's a very large population, growing population of immigrant and refugee families. And it's been a real culture clash. In fact, Kent, the history of it was a northwestern stronghold for the KKK. And so the history is very much on the table in places like Kent. And so Shamso Isaac, who is the coalition leader for Living Well Kent, and Jimmy Johnson, who is an African-American minister without walls, they are the co-chairs of this coalition. And I could tell you tons and tons of stories about Kent, but I'm going to focus in on one of the areas where they've done a lot of interesting work, which is around their food systems. They decided they wanted to create a food policy council, food coalition, to start to create, to really deal with the food insecurity in their communities, right? So this group of young people, they have a youth advisory group that has started to change school policies on a bunch of different fronts, including their menus, including how food is sourced, and done it in a really productive way, despite the fact that for a time there were 3,000 calls a day from some outside group that's told folks that they were trying to institute Sharia law. And thankfully a lot of people in the community came around to kind of set the record straight. They continue to move on, but the thing that I wanted to point out here is when the CDC first engaged us in the Seattle Foundation, they very politely, not so many words, said, we'd really like your team to help out Kent because they're great, we'd like to be able to get more money to them, but they're a low capacity community. Okay, and the truth of the matter is that Kent is some of the best organizers we've ever met in the United States, by far, hands down, right? So, but they, in a couple of hours together with publicly accessible data, we started to create maps around their food accessibility. And with very little prompting, they started to tell stories about why they had food deserts, why they had challenges, where there were opportunities, and they started telling stories about what they envisioned in the future with these maps. Heck, people from Seattle that have money should be coming down here because we've got the best recipes, the best chefs, we've got food that they never get even up in Seattle. So they started to see their world very differently. And before you knew it, within a few weeks, they had a partnership with the YMCA and the Industrial Food Kitchen. They started having 2 different regular farmers markets. Fast forward about a year later, they have a 20,000-foot grow house where they actually have a co-op where they're growing. All of these things based on stories from it wasn't their data, it was a story they started to tell about it. So we've heard this several times today. I like this quote from Andy Goodman: "We remain devoted to data, enamored of empirical evidence. And while we will always need hard facts to make our cases, we often fail to realize that the battle for hearts and minds starts with hearts." So they started to use data in their very strategically. And we see this in a lot of our advocacy work. One of our sister organizations is called Institute for People, Place, and Possibility. We do a lot of data. We produce a public portal called the Community Commons. And I think what KIT has done, is they basically balance people's experience. Some people talk about lived experience inside of folks that are there in the community with data. They've figured out how to do that well. And they've leveraged visualization and new technologies, not to be wooed by it because there's all types of eye candy out there, but they've started to use that pretty strategically. And the funny thing is, one of the major foundations in Seattle, after KIT had spent very little time using data, said, we'd like you to start to use data to create all of our regional food assessments. So they went from the group that was low capacity to, could you help us create our food assessment and track it regionally across the Puget Sound? Which I think isn't very wise. It just shows you how kind of a little bit fickle this is. So the other piece I would just put in there about making wise use of data, which I think is a really important practice, is increasingly using improvement tools. So down here at the bottom, KIT's done a little bit of this. They still have some other work they need to do around this front, but these are annotated run charts. And our work, those of you who do a lot of improvement work, we built this with Institute for Healthcare Improvement and scale communities, is how do we create tools for change makers that are so intuitive that they can naturally just start to plug their data in there and start to interpret, why do we see changes in it? How do we start to know when we're making changes and why, not just relying on secondary data? So whole different talk we could do about that. Since I am in the Fox Cities, and I feel very grateful to be in the Fox Cities and have had a chance to work with several of you around the table for the last year or so, there is a bunch of assets in this community, as you all know, this region, and Paula pointed out some of them. But one of the initiatives I think is an emerging leading practice is Imagine Fox Cities. And Imagine Fox Cities is an effort that Paula and Peter and Adriana and Jason and Tammy are all kind of leaders around, and we have the privilege of kind of helping to be a little bit of outside coaches and facilitators on this, has embraced this notion of intergenerational well-being. And so the beauty of what I think that Imagine Fox Cities has done is they've started without knowing. And they've started to get comfortable with engaging without knowing exactly where this is heading. And it's a little bit uncomfortable for some here. But it's brave. And they started to kind of rally around this notion of well-being, which is not just a popular concept these days. Every major community or college association we're working with has embraced well-being. American Hospital Association, everybody's moving towards well-being. And part of it, my belief, is because well-being is at our mental, our spiritual, our social, our sense of purpose, our financial. We're looking at the whole person. And from an economy point of view, we're not looking at just economic-centric measures. So I think that what Fox Cities is doing, these 7 vital conditions are some of the vital conditions we're working with another partner here, is starting to kind of reframe what our North Star is. It's not saying that there's a prescriptive North Star here, but we're starting to think about really measuring these different versions of well-being, and I think this will happen a lot in our community transformation work. And doing these intergenerational dialogues. This is a photo, I think, of a dialogue, and there's how many dialogues that we've had so far?
76.
76 dialogues, and if you haven't been to the quote-unquote war room, it should be a prosperity room, of all of this work around discerning and really listening in with dialogues all across this region. So there's a lot that we could say about Imagine Fox Cities, but I would just say that what it's pointing to is this kind of growing and sharing leadership. When Walt Rugland, who's a senior leader here at college, came to meet up with me in Green Bay, I guess, some time ago, Walt, who's a senior leader, some of you may know him, was like, he cared about the civic mindedness of the next generation. He cared about stewardship and what this starts to look like. And this group has very intentionally started to say, how do we start to engage the next generation and voices that have not always been included here? And we're still early on in that thing, but there's an earnestness that I think is really important, that I think is a leading practice of a lot of groups. Making time for civic reflection, we've heard that in different ways. Taking time for huddles, taking time to stand back and see what this work starts to look like. Beth, who is a co-chair of this, had borrowed this term from Krista Tippett, you know, that does on Being. She has an NPR radio, right? Around civic reflection and social courage. And I think what's starting to emerge here is there's a ton of stuff going on. There's an abundance here, but how do we step back and look at the broader systems from a different framework and start to exercise civic reflection and social courage? And in fact, this, I think thinking about an intergenerational frame is one of the ways that we start to disrupt. We see a lot more, just not nice little, here's some youth on an advisory board, but literally bringing in the next generation with, in some cases, some moral clarity to think differently about our larger systems. One other side, I'm sorry, I'm going to pay attention to my tongue because I'll quick through this real quick. One of the groups that's working with this is actually Rethink Health, which is Bobby Milsink will be here at the beginning of the following month, is a systems thinker. So one of the things that we're hoping will happen, and I think we're on the pathway, is stepping back from anchor institutions to look at this with Rethink Health, with funding from RWJF, to really think about what are the investments in the next generation. Let's quit thinking about the next quarter, the next year, the next election cycle, and how do we start to pattern a whole new way of stewarding resources. I'm going to show just a quick video and then is that okay? I think I'll be within 2 minutes. I know Jason is a stickler. Jason, can you? This is my last practice, and I'm moving away from just a single community to a network. This is the Center for Good Purchasing. I recently joined their board, and our technology team builds technology for them. But they've inspired a lot of recent changes